In this video, I'll be constructing the 37mm single mount anti-aircraft guns. Originally, I had intended to also show the construction of the twin mount 37mm guns, but since the guns are very different and due to the time and complexity for constructing each of these different mounts, I decided to split it into two videos. So this video will be on the construction of the single mount version of this gun. Only 4 of these are required and they go on the bow of the ship. These 37mm single mount guns are the simplest of the 3 different types of photo-etch anti-aircraft guns that need to be constructed for this ship. Since I'll be working with very fine photo-etch, the first thing I'm going to do is change the blade on my knife. A fresh blade will help with cutting the photo-etch and not deforming it. With pieces as small as these, you don't have much scope to touch up the part after you've cut it. So having a sharp blade that will cut cleanly right at the edge of the part is quite important at this stage. Now that I have a fresh blade, I can start with cutting out the parts. Before I began construction of these guns, I searched online for some photos. I wanted to see what they really look like and wanted to see how they are painted. And it turns out these guns were painted in 2 colors. So for this ship, the mount needs to be in a light gray color and the gun needs to be painted in black. So because of that, and because of the small size of these guns, I'm going to have to construct them in 2 parts, paint those parts, and then glue those painted parts together. To start this off, I'll work on building the gun portion. The first thing I need to do is fold into a little rectangle this piece of photo-etch. This is the machinery of the gun, and then the barrel, which is another piece of photo-etch, will be glued onto the front of this. This is one of the larger parts of this gun to construct, and being just a simple rectangle is fairly easy to do. My thinking here is to partially fold these rectangles, just not close off the ends, because in that way I'll then have an entrance to the inside of this rectangular tube, so I can apply the super glue from the inside. That will just make it such that when I do put the super glue on, I won't accidentally hit or obstruct any of the finer detail on the outside of this part. And then once the long end is properly bonded, I can then close up these smaller end pieces and have a strong little box. Photo-etch anti-aircraft guns are definitely the most tedious part of building a battleship, and that's because they are both the most numerous part that you have to create copies of, and also because they are going to be the smallest and most difficult to work with parts. I do think they are worth the effort though. They look quite a lot better than the plastic parts that come with these kits normally. After doing the initial fold in all of these parts, I then got my extra thin super glue, which I then applied using this piece of wire and a pin vise on the inside of this part. These guns aren't too bad. They consist of 7 parts. That's not too bad. That's pretty average for a 37 or 40mm gun. And there's only one part of this construction that I think is a little bit tricky, and that's the mount itself has got a curve on it. Other than that, these aren't very difficult to construct, and there are only 4 of them, so it's not too tedious. It's quite a nice gun for me to ease into the process of building these anti-aircraft guns for this ship. The part that looks to be quite complicated is the twin mount version of this gun, which has the smallest piece of photo-etch I have ever seen. After applying the glue to the inside of all these parts, I then folded in the short edges, held it firmly with some tweezers, and applied the thin super glue to ensure that they are properly glued down. And of course, I had to repeat this process 4 times for all of the parts. Now the box is complete, I can glue on the guns. The guns are just a single piece of photo-etch, you don't even need to fold it. There's a small tab at the end of the barrel, which slots into a little hole on the block. So for this, you basically just need to put a little bit of glue on that tab and be able to insert it into that hole, and you're done. I would have much preferred it if these were brass barrels. Photo-etch obviously is thin, so it looks a bit odd from above. You don't have the proper effect of a circular barrel, but it's still considerably better than the plastic guns that come with the ship. The plastic guns are just too big. They are out of scale. First I tried to install them using the thin super glue. I dipped the end of the barrel into the glue and then inserted it into the block. But the glue was drying a little bit too quickly and it didn't give me enough time to maneuver it into the correct place. Extra thin super glue dries very quickly, and that meant it just snapped off because the glue had dried and I still needed to position it. So now I tried again using thick super glue. I put a bit of the glue on the end of the gun and inserted it into the hole. The thick super glue dries a lot more slowly, and that gave me time to then maneuver the gun to get it positioned. You want it to be aligned straight in both your vertical and horizontal axes. As the thick super glue dries, it becomes more and more difficult to maneuver, and eventually it'll harden and not allow any movement. On the second gun, I didn't notice it at the time, but the hole where I needed to put this gun wasn't properly etched through onto the photo etch part. I initially thought that it had been filled with super glue and I had just not properly inserted it the first time. So I cleaned off the glue with some acetone, but confirmed there really wasn't a hole there. And instead of trying to drill a hole, a very, very small hole through this piece of photo etch, I decided it would be easier to just cut off the tab on the back of the gun and then stick the gun directly onto the block. It would just require a bit more precision in getting it properly located, but there was still an etching on this block, so I could see where to position it correctly. In the grand scheme of things, it won't make a difference at all. It was just a little bit of a frustration. The other two guns were a lot more cooperative. I then did pay a little bit more attention and checked these remaining two boxes and confirmed that the holes were present and the installation was smooth for them. On the top of these guns goes a small piece that looks like ammunition clip, but isn't. It's a cover that I think protects the sights for the gun. That has to be painted in the light grey color. So at this stage I won't install it because I intend to paint this entire piece in black. However, there is a structure that goes underneath the gun, and that is used to rotate the gun on the vertical axis. So that is the next part that I then worked on. These pieces need to be folded in half and then stuck to the underneath of the gun. I'd initially tried to fold these parts with tweezers, but the support structures that attach each of the halves together were a little bit too far apart for my tweezers and were actually a little bit stronger than I expected to be. So I didn't feel confident that I could safely bend them with tweezers. So I pulled out my photo etch folding tool. The photo etch folding tool is a little bit slower to work with because you have to position things more precisely, but it is a safer tool to create folds with. If you can't properly fold across the entire length of a joint, you run the risk of putting unwanted bends onto the part and then causing some damage. Once folded most of the way with the photo etch folding tool, I then used tweezers to clamp them together and made sure that they were permanently bonded with some extra thin super glue. Once folded, they are ready to be installed on the gun. On the gun there is a small little notch on the underneath where these parts will go. There are a number of ways that you could have done this. The way I decided to install these was to use my super glue applicator to place a tiny bit of thick super glue in that notch and then place this semicircular structure onto it. I'm thinking as always, what is the easiest way to put on super glue such that I won't create an unnecessary excess? So my options here were to position dry the structure and then use extra thin super glue to glue it in place. That wouldn't work because these parts are too small and it would be difficult to hold them steadily. The next option is to put the thick super glue onto the semicircular structure and then bring that into contact with the gun's block. The risk there is that if you miss the notch, then you can glue the part to the wrong place and you'll create an additional mess of glue on the part. And the third option was to apply the glue to the block in the notch in the correct place and then bring the semicircular structure into contact with the block. In this scenario, if I miss, it doesn't matter. If I get it right on the first time, I get the semicircular structure into the notch, it's in the correct place, and it will stick. I don't have to worry about excess glue being spread around on the part. With the installation of those parts, that's as far as I can go with the gun itself. So I then moved on to working on the gun's mount. This part will be painted in light grey and the gun will be painted in black. On this gun, this part, in my opinion, is the most difficult to work with. You can see the front of the gun's shield there has a curve on it with those two little forks, and that has to be curved to suit those side panels. As I've said before in other videos, I don't like working with curves, especially very small curves like this, because it's quite difficult to bend them into the appropriate shape. As you can see, it's very awkward to do that because you need to bend it with these wings sticking out of the side that also extend quite far and are in the way. So yeah, it's really about finding the appropriate sized cylinder to bend it on. Obviously a knife is way too thick, so I then moved down onto some precision screwdrivers. The first one that I chose was also too big, so then I moved down yet again onto an even smaller screwdriver and then tried to bend it over there. But the problem I had was it was difficult to grip the thing. So then my next evolution in thinking was to use some locking tweezers to hold the base of the gun and then try to bend it around the screwdriver. But even in the process of doing that, it still was a bit frustrating because these little wings sticking out on the side didn't really give me enough space to hold those forks to bend just them, because if I used my whole finger to try and grip it, I would then also bend these wings, which need to be flat. So it was all rather frustrating to get it quite how I wanted it to be. Should actually look into seeing if there's some kind of a tool that I can buy to make this a little bit easier. And imagine some kind of a narrow wheel or something with a lot of different diameters that you can attach to the end of it that I can use for bending a single wire could be helpful, because this is just really frustrating. It's really difficult to get the curve right. And if the curve isn't right, the pieces want to stand off from each other, so you need to hold them properly when you're gluing them together because they want to spring apart. One side is not the same as the other side, which then causes the part to warp, and then things don't stand up correctly because they're all a bit misaligned. So it takes a lot of backwards and forwards the way I'm doing it here to get it into an acceptable position. Can't help but thinking there's got to be a better way of doing this. Once the parts are in a good enough position, I then hold them in place with fingers and tweezers and apply the super glue from the inside. This task had to be repeated 4 times. For the mounts, because the front panel is completely smooth, I don't mind getting excess super glue onto that because I can always just come back with sandpaper and remove it. It's getting the additional glue on the sides that's problematic for these parts, because then that goes over details and will conceal it. Also, always remember, if it does go very wrong with photo-etch parts, you can place them in acetone to dissolve the super glue and start again. After the base structure of the mount was glued together, these little arms needed to be attached. These arms just need to be cut out and glued on. There's no folds on them, so in that respect they're quite easy. In fact, although fairly small, these parts are not difficult to install. The trick is to just hold them in the correct place for long enough for the glue to dry sufficiently to hold the part. For this task, I used extra thick super glue, applied it to the ends of this armature structure, and gently brought the parts into contact. While the glue is drying, the arm just needs to be held in the correct location until the glue hardens and is able to support the structure on its own. After initially gluing them down with the thick super glue, I then took extra thin super glue and applied additional glue from the back of the part to reinforce it. I don't want these parts to accidentally fall off because they weren't properly glued down. With the arm installed, I then stuck the mount to its base. I intentionally left the bases of the mounts attached to the photo-etch. I wanted them on the photo-etch sprue because it would give me a better way of handling and aligning the parts. If I removed them and stuck them on a piece of masking tape, they can still move. You can damage these small little structures like the seats and wheels that surround the actual mount. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to just glue them securely in place without having to handle the part too much. And I knew that once they were stuck down with the parts still attached to this photo-etch sprue, I would be able to cut the little connections from the seats and the wheels to the sprue and also fold them while the part is attached to the sprue. And that would just make it a little bit easier to handle everything. At this point, there was no real need to remove them from the sprue. I think it also makes everything a little bit easier to correctly align. If you can see all the parts next to each other and they're all at the same angle, you can also compare from part to part and know that the way you're gluing them together, it's quite difficult to get symmetry and everything correct on such small parts. So using whatever tools you have available to get that right is worth it. Fortunately, this was a fairly cooperative process. Doing it this way is quite easy. You have a lot of time to work with the parts if you're using this thick super glue. I use the thick super glue because there is fine detail all the way around the mounting. So I didn't think it'd be possible to get thin super glue in even on the little wire that I use without covering up some of the detail. So in this case, I opted to use a little drop of extra thick super glue in the center of the part. And then because it's thick super glue, have some time to maneuver everything to make sure that they are correctly centered and aligned. Once the glue had dried, I then cut off the little structures that connect the seats and wheels to the sprue, and then was able to fold them into their correct locations. If I had taken these off the sprue, I would need to have thought about how to hold the gun mount itself while creating these folds, with them still stuck to the sprue. Obviously you don't have to worry about that. The sprue will hold them in place, and I can quite easily bend the parts without having to worry about causing damage to any other components on the mount. One other thing that I should probably point out is that I don't just run into these things and start building them. I plan out the build for quite a lot of time before I start. Even for parts like this, I was thinking about how I was actually going to construct these things, the order in which I would do things, how I would hold things at various stages of the build. And I had intended to keep them in the sprue for this work, specifically to make it easier to hold them while working with these fine details. And also knowing that then having this buffer of metal around the part would help protect it while it's in this vulnerable state when you're handling it. Having said that, while having a plan is important, it's also important to recognize if your plan isn't working the way you'd hoped it would be working, and then to adapt, and instead of just doggedly sticking with something that's causing you trouble. For example, I'd intended to keep these guns stuck to the mount for the entire process, including painting, but it then became apparent that that would be a mistake, because if I were to then cut the part off after painting, there'd then be cut marks that I need to touch up, and there'd be more back and forth over there. So I decided I would then cut these parts off before I painted. A small thing, but you need to have some adaptability to your plan. You need to have a plan, and you need to recognize when your plan might have a weakness and be willing to adapt it. Also, you can see at the very end here, before I paint, I took one of the unpainted guns and I did a test fit on these parts. Just wanted to make sure before I went and put paint on these things that everything was reasonably put together and that it would fit without too much trouble. With the construction of the mounts, these parts are then as constructed as they can be without being painted. So I then, of course, moved on to the painting phase. As I previously said, the mount will be painted in the light grey color, which is the same color as the camouflage, and the gun barrel and its machinery will be painted in black. I also need to paint these covers that go on the top of the gun in the light grey color. Here, I made a small mistake. I should have folded and glued these parts together before I painted them. In the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty small mistake. Later on in the build, I fold them and then touch up the seam line where the glue had gone in. Ultimately, it was a pretty small mistake, but hey, I could have made life a little bit easier if I had folded and glued them before I started painting. As you can see over here, the gun mounts are now removed from their sprue and attached them to a piece of card using masking tape. This light grey color is the same color that I've used for the rest of the camouflage on the ship. It's from a series of bottles that I had mixed at the very beginning of the build to ensure color consistency. It's already pre-thinned to the correct consistency. It's roughly 50% paint and 50% acrylic thinner. After a couple of rounds of painting, I was then happy with the finish and then moved on to painting the guns. For the most part, I don't like things in black. Black conceals details. You can see on this card already just during the painting phase, the parts disappear into the background. So on this, I will do some, I suppose, highlighting using a light panel line instead of a black panel line. It's very hard to see on the screen, but at this point they have been painted to my satisfaction. After letting the color coat dry for a few hours, I then sprayed the paint with Tamiya X22. This is a gloss varnish, and will prepare the paint for weathering. I'll be using 2 washes for this process. On the light gray parts, I'll be using black panel line, and on the black parts, I'll be using light gray panel line. The intention here is really just to bring out the details. The clear varnish has 2 purposes. First, it'll help prepare the part for weathering. It will make it such that the panel line moves more easily, and it will also protect the underlying paint from knocks and scratches because it has a harder finish than regular paint. It was at this point that I realized my mistake and that I needed to fold these little covers. So I then quickly did that. Initially, I thought I could just fold them flat and get away with it, but they did stand up a little bit, which was something that I found frustrating and not something that I was willing to accept. So I then opened them up again and used a little bit of thick super glue to permanently stick them shut. It was then time to apply the panel line, starting on the black pieces with the light gray panel line. For a part like this, I wasn't entirely sure how it would work. Once again, I'm just looking for a subtle effect that adds a little bit of life to the parts. I'm not at all worried about putting on too much because these parts are covered in that gloss coat. If there is an excess, I can very easily remove it with turpentine. Using a light panel line on a dark part is not nearly as effective as using a dark panel line on a light part. It is unfortunate, but on those black pieces, it is just always going to be more difficult to see the detail. But it is what it is, and I'll just have to accept it. My normal process with weathering light parts is to put on the panel line and then to remove the excess with turpentine. But on these parts where they are themselves very small, with even smaller detail than normal, I didn't want to have to use turpentine to remove the panel line because I think it would just remove everything and you wouldn't be able to see the details. So my goal here was to come in with the brush barely wetted with panel line and only put on enough such that it would reveal the details and then not have to remove any excess. If I did put too much panel line on a part during this process, I could then continue working it with the same brush and the solvent that is on the brush already in the paint and absorb it back into the brush and then transfer it onto that piece of paper. This process worked quite well and I was happy with the result. In the end, I did not have to use turpentine on these parts to remove the excess, and all the detail came through pretty well. Even if it's very hard to see that detail with your eyes. I think Flyhawk went a little bit overboard with the detail on these anti-aircraft guns. They are very small and the detail is in itself very small. It's not something that people are going to reasonably notice. I think they could have gotten away with a simpler design of a gun, but hey, if they're going to provide the detail and the parts, I'm going to build it. When it came to the light panel line on the black guns, I thought there was too much. So in this case, I did get out the turpentine and clean them off a bit. I don't really know how to make the weathering on dark pieces look very good. You effectively want to do highlighting, but the raised edges and parts on these guns are so small, I don't know how you can effectively do highlighting on these pieces. In the grand scheme of things, this is such a small part that if it doesn't look perfect, it won't really ruin the overall effect of the ship. So it doesn't really matter that you can't see all the detail on them. With all the parts painted and panel liner applied, and then a complete installation of these guns and their mounts, I started by attaching this little cover to the top of the gun. I did this using a little bit of extra thick super glue on the tip of the part and then positioning it on the gun. Because these parts are so small, even a little bit of super glue will instantly be able to grip and hold the part in the correct location before the glue has even dried. And that's quite helpful because it gives you a lot of time to then work and position the part to make sure that it is properly aligned on all 3 axes. A set of locking tweezers is very useful for this work. It just enables you to hold the gun much more easily and not have to worry about dropping it accidentally. Although I do quite often drop things accidentally, regardless of whether or not they're locking tweezers. And now for the final stage of construction, attaching the gun to its mount. If all has gone well, the gun will fit perfectly in the mount and it'll be tight enough to hold it, but not so tight that it can't fit in. If it is a bit too tight, then you have to get the tweezers in there to spread apart those arms a little bit and get it to sit in there nicely. You can see this piece is sitting in there and being held loosely on its own quite happily. I think that's a really good fit, but I can't reasonably expect all of the parts to be perfect. They just need to be close enough such that I'm able to get the gun in and position it reasonably. My initial thought was to try and position the guns and then come with extra thin super glue and glue them in place once I had positioned them dry. But it became apparent fairly quickly that that wouldn't work. Although the guns in some cases would fit in perfectly, in other cases there would be just a fraction of a millimeter too much clearance and it wouldn't be strong enough to grip the gun. And that led me to move on to my second strategy, which was to apply a little bit of thick super glue to the arms and then position the gun in the mount. Once again, extra thick super glue dries more slowly than the thin super glue, and this gives me time to position the gun in the mount even after it's in contact with the super glue. And once it's in the position that I'm happy with, you then just need to hold it steady for a few seconds so that the glue can grip. On parts this small, using super glue accelerator is also not really an option. The problem with super glue accelerator is if you apply it to a surface, then any future glue that you apply to that surface will also instantly set. And because these parts are so small, it's not really possible to apply the accelerator so precisely that it will only work on the location that you're gluing at that time, which means when you're gluing down a future component, it'll probably lock up that glue before you get your parts in contact. Unless it's the very last bit of photo etch that you're gluing down, which I suppose is the case over here, I would prefer to not use accelerator on small photo etch parts like this. For most of the pieces in this work, the parts are light enough such that they are able to be held in place with friction. So it's not really necessary as well. You can get by without using accelerator. Another thing that I'll point out with anti-aircraft guns is if you find what I'm doing intimidating and it is discouraging you from building them, please try anyway. The reality is that if you break a photo etch anti-aircraft gun, it doesn't matter because you still have the plastic parts in the kit. Try and build the guns, see how it goes, get better at it, develop your skills, and if it goes wrong, use the plastic part. And if it goes well, then you got the better guns. So don't be discouraged. It does take some time and thought and patience, well, a lot of patience really, to build these things. But building these guns, I think, is very rewarding. You go and point to a little card and you say, on this card there are over 100 pieces of photo etch. Well, not on this card, but on some of them there are over 100 pieces of photo etch, and it's just this tiny little thing, size of a business card. You think, well, that's quite remarkable that you're able to construct a part or a gun that small. And after completing this process another 3 times, the final gun was installed. And that meant these parts were all ready for their final stage of construction, which is sealing everything in and matting it down with a coat of matte varnish. For the matte varnish, I'm using Mr. Color 182. This is my preferred varnish. It has a very good matte effect, and a little bit goes a very long way. A quick spray of all the parts, and that will matte it down and seal everything in and give you that nice consistent matte look. After letting these parts dry for a bit, they were then ready to be installed. After all that preparation and construction, the installation of these guns is very simple. I use a toothpick to apply a drop of extra thick super glue to its mount and then place the gun on top of the glue. In the few seconds that you have while the glue is drying, I then position the gun to make sure that it is properly aligned to the ship. This is the stage of constructing a ship where it feels like you're never making any progress. You can spend weeks building anti-aircraft guns and you put them on the ship and it's as if you haven't done anything. They are such small details, but if you don't look for them, you don't really see them. But it is these small details, when all combined together, that really do make the ship look good. So as I say, try and build photo-etch anti-aircraft guns. If you can get ones with brass barrels, get the ones with brass barrels. They look a lot better. But photo-etch barrels will do, and will be considerably better than the plastic photo-etch guns that come with the kit. Don't be intimidated by them. Try and build them. If it goes poorly, you have the fallback to the parts in the plastic kit. So give it a try and treat it as a learning experience. And with photo-etch, especially guns like this, which are entirely constructed out of photo-etch, if it goes wrong and you want to start again, you can do that very easily. Just drop them in some acetone, dissolve the glue, and start again. In the next video, I'll be building the twin mount 37mm guns. They are quite a lot more complex than these ones, and have also got the smallest piece of photo-etch that I've ever worked with. I created a post on the YouTube channel for a comparison between that part and a grain of salt, showing how that part makes a grain of salt look big. That will be the next video. So I hope you are up for a series of videos on building 1 in 350 scale anti-aircraft guns. See you then. Cheers.